Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War Warhammer 2 Cold Match gameplay. This time around we are in Bleakdale playing as the Brettonians against the Dark Elves, and I decided to do something a little bit different this time around compared to what I usually do with Brettonia. And that is go a little bit wider on the infantry. Normally when I do play the Brettonians, I usually go with the usual 5 cavalry unit build, which I think is generally one of the more competitive builds, but figured one of the experiences I've had against Dark Elves lately have been that they often center their army around the Black Guard. They often center their army around sort of more elite infantry, which makes Grail Guardians not that competitive. Grail Guardians, sure, you can maneuver, you can try to move around, but oftentimes they'll get bogged down. You need them to hold your line because the rest of your infantry just buckles. If you bring a sort of more men-at-arms centric army, they'll just collapse. The Grail Guardians get isolated, and then they get massacred by Black Guard or Dark Shards units like that in due order. Before the rest of your cavalry can kind of deal with the back line and collapse the flanks. So I figured instead of trying to go with that elite sort of cavalry build, I would go with an infantry-based army or infantry-based corps. So the Fan Enchantress is still sort of the main focus here, but this time around she's just going to be backing a slightly more elite front line as far as Brettonians go, of course. And then, of course, the usual quad heavy cav on the flank. So going over the build real quick, for my Lord, Fan Enchantress with all her abilities, goblet, the Chalice of Potions, and then of course Regrowth and Earthblood. So going for full heal build, 2 Peasant Bowmen with Fire Arrows. I think Peasant Bows are really good in this matchup. They help suppress Dark Shards, they can help deal with Witch Elves, they can help deal with Sister of Slaughter, units like that. They're just a very, very good unit. Plus they can help zone off if your opponent decides to bring the Pegasus, the Dark Rider, Pegasus variant, I forget what they're called, Raven Heralds, I do believe. For my front line, 2 units of Men-at-Arms with shields, as well as a single unit of Peasant Bomb, just to soak up arrows, essentially, and to buffer off charges. They are backed by 3 units of Foot Squires, as well as the Regiment of Renown Battle Pilgrims, the Holy Wardens of Lamais and Tal. I figured I didn't really need the anti-large Foot Squires, because, quite frankly, I've got enough anti-large between all my knights, and Foot Squires do trade pretty well with the lower-end Dark Elf units. They'll take on Black Ark Corsairs effectively. They'll of course deal with Dread Spears and all units like that very, very well. And honestly, if you hit them, especially if you hit them with the Blessing of the Lady, they can actually tear through units like Black Guard very effectively. And that really comes down to their high weapon strength of 35. They've got bonus of 9 against large, or against infantry, sorry, which puts them up to a really pretty solid armor piercing value. They're probably looking at like over 30 armor piercing damage with every hit, probably like 32, 33. Which will tear through, say, Black Guard pretty effectively. And that means that I do have a core that can kind of handle Black Guard that my opponent might bring. On the flanks, we do have 3 units of Grail Knights backed by a single unit of the Companions of Quenelles out here on the flank. I do like the Companions of Quenelles quite a lot in this matchup. They do provide some additional AP punch. For my opponent, a very non-elite army. You can actually see, and I was actually pretty shocked by this. Going into this, my opponent actually outnumbers me. Now, sure, Dark Elves can go really wide, but this was still surprising. My opponent's build, he did bring a Dark Sorceress somewhere down here. She is actually on foot, or a Supreme Sorceress, sorry, with Enfeebling Foe and Melkot's Miasma. She does have her survivability options. I do believe it's, what is it called, the Opal Amulet, as well as Arcane Conduit and Smoke and Mirrors. So, going very light on the spells, going very cheap here. We're not seeing any Ends Ripples, Black Horror, or anything like that. Basically just a cheap supporting Lord. A front line composed of Black Ark Corsairs will dumpster any sort of lower-end Brettonian infantry, and they'll honestly trade okay. Not amazing, but they'll trade okay with Foot Squires and hold the Holy Wardens, largely thanks to their armor and bonus first infantry. They are backed by the Helibroni, so some Dread Spears and more Dread Spears here in the back. Single unit of Witch Elves to type cavalry, always a good choice against Brettonia. 2 Dark Riders and 2 Doomfire Warlocks, one of which is the Slaanesh Harvesters. Personally, in my opinion, I think if there is a matchup where Doomfire Warlocks are terrible and not a good pick, this is it. I would not recommend them. Granted, they do have some great buffs and debuffs with their bounce spells, but they tend to get dumpstered very, very hard by Brettonian cavalry. So regardless, the lines are moving very quickly towards each other. There's not much point in any sort of gimmicky maneuvering. We've both gone very wide. We're going to have to clash somewhere, so we're kind of closing in on each other. You can see I sally forward a little bit with the Fan Enchantress and then pull back. Now the Peasant Bows are going to start unloading on the Dark Shards. You can see that opening volley doing quite an okay amount of damage. Peasant Bows, of course, inaccurate. They're not an amazing sort of unit, but you know, for their cost, they're going to do some good work here against the Dark Shards, and especially when they're strung out like this, the inaccuracy just doesn't matter that much. And you can see these Dark Shards just having a terrible time against that mass peasant fire. In the meantime, the front line, you can see the foot squires plowing in, going in against these Black Arc Corsairs, and men-at-arms with shields are surprisingly survivable. One of the key problems with men-at-arms is actually usually just their leadership. It tends to fall apart and then they rout. But as far as their actual stats go, their combat stats, they're a decent unit. So here with the foot squires in the mix, they should hold okay. On the flanks here, you can see we do have the Mortis Engine effect going down as Fey Enchantress dives in. The Peasant Mob, of course, immediately routes, but the Holy Wardens, as well as the foot squires here, despite the peppering fire coming in, are going to be doing some monstrous work. And you can see with the favor of the Fey, despite all the fire coming in from the Dark Shards, they're doing monstrous work. On the flanks, in the meantime, the cavalry is engaging. You can see the men-at-arms with shields, despite being hit by a Soul Blight here, hold up the Black Arc Corsairs, who then get run over by Grail Knights and the companions of Quenelles. So my opponent really just doesn't have the tools to stop them. On the other flank, in the meantime, you can see two lance formations just piling in, or more importantly, just kind of sitting around for a little bit. But shortly thereafter, one unit is going to just get clipped a little bit by the spears there, but pushed into the Dark Shards. The other unit cycles around. It has been hit by a Word of Pain, but honestly, on the charge, that will not matter. Peasants routed, you know, some good damage on the foot squires thanks to all those Dark Shards, but my opponent just doesn't have the tools to shut all these annoying troops down. Back here, despite the surround by Doomfire Warlocks, Dark Riders, Dread Spears, the Grail Knights are, of course, plunging onward and doing boatloads of damage. They're just such a potent unit, and actually the Slunches Harvesters are going to start taking a beating pretty shortly. You can see we're just tearing through these units very, very quickly. I actually turned these Grail Knights around, avoiding these Witch Elves, and we are actually going to get a little bit of a meaty charge here into the flanks of these troops, just completely disrupting them and really causing some nasty hurt. And this center has completely buckled. All these Black Arc Corsairs are in full flight. The Peasant Bows are going to start unloading on these Witch Elves, and let's watch what happens. They're currently at 4,800 HP, and a single volley of Peasant Bowmen fire, and despite that physical resist, you can see they've lost a good sort of 2,000 HP. The Grail Knights turn around, get a meaty charge in there. Witch Elves do not hold up against this at all, and they're getting completely destroyed. A Soul Stealer has gone down, which is melting these guys, but on the other flank, disaster for the Dark Elves. You can see the Dread Spears getting slaughtered. Granted, the Supreme Sorcerer is trying to hold things together here, but it's just a little too late. Grail Knights are getting us surrounded. Companions of Quenelles are in there. All these foot squires, all these the Holy Wardens, men-at-arms with shields just pouring through, and Brettonia is really on the loose here. You can see the Dark Shards not able to hold. You can see, of course, the Doomfire Warlocks do terrible in this matchup, and I really would not, if there is one matchup, like I said, I do not recommend them, it is this one. Regardless, you can see the Dark Shards getting peppered down by the Peasant Bows, who have been just doing immense work for their cost. Peasant Bowmen are so good in this matchup. They can tear through Hydras, they can tear through Charybdis, they can tear through units like that very, very efficiently. You can see this front line just buckling. The Dark Shards back here having a terrible time. My opponent does rally some troops, but really, at this point, it is way too little, way too late. Dread Spears here getting bogged down. Sure, my opponent is able to get some troops in there. Yeah, these Grail Knights got mauled pretty bad. But they were stuck in there against multiple Dread Spears. Over here on the flank, you can see the Hellbroni and the Black Arc Corsairs actually traded pretty well with the Foot Squires, probably due to the Hellbroni's poison, to be honest. But really, it just doesn't matter at this point, as my opponent's army completely shatters. So, a decisive win for Brettonia, or a close victory according to the thing, but really a pretty handy win, I think, for Brettonia. I'm not entirely sure how these victories are calculated, probably based on losses. And we did, of course, lose some peasants, so it was not a decisive victory, just close, but I would say it was pretty decisive. I do think this is a pretty competitive build against the Dark Elves. You do have a pretty solid infantry core that can kind of butcher their lower-end Dark Elf infantry that you'll often see in this matchup. And Foot Squires, especially with the Blessing of the Lady, can do a lot of hurt against Blackguard. And probably more than Grail Guardians can. The big problem with Grail Guardians is, of course, they don't have much HP. They don't really hit very hard. And while they're a very strong unit, and especially if your opponent decides to bring, say, Sister of Slaughter or Witch Elves, they'll do really well in those sorts of situations. They just are not that good of a matchup against Blackguard, which are a very common sight. My opponent didn't bring them here, but I think I would have probably actually ended up doing better had my opponent gone with Blackguard, because I had a wider frontage with which I could sort of deal with them more handily. Going really quickly over the build, the Grail Knights, of course, are a very useful pick in this. They are always great. They're good. Grail Knights are good in just about every matchup. The only matchup that I wouldn't recommend them is Dwarves. Partially because Rune Lord's pretty common and he counteracts you with magic damage. Of course, Dwarves have built-in magic resistance, and Grail Knights, no AP, very susceptible to cannon fire. So there's a few reasons there I wouldn't recommend them against Dwarves. But basically against any other faction, I would say Grail Knights are a must-bring. They're just such a good pick. You should always have at least a unit or two of them. Companions of Quenelles, also great work, 92 kills. They just shredded through those Black Arc Corsairs. They just dumpstered that my opponent's line. And Well, that's so potent. You can see the cavalry just doing such good work here. The infantry, not such great work, but honestly, they were getting peppered down by the dark shards. That was one of the only things the dark shards got done, was peppering down some of these foot squires. So, you know, they held, and some of them did manage to breach the line for me. They did. They definitely did an okay job. And the peasant bows, such a great unit in this matchup, in my opinion. Oftentimes, you will see dark elf players bring dark shards, usually the unshielded variant, figuring, of course, that Brettonian range is not particularly good. And then the peasant bows will do really well, and you can see here they're racked up over 60 kills between the two units. Most of that against dark shards, against witch elves, units like that. So very, very cost effective, very powerful units there. You can see the witch elves did absolutely nothing. For my opponent's build, and I would say this is pretty competitive, but for my opponent's build, from his perspective, my key critique here is bringing Doomfire Warlocks. If there's a matchup where these guys are bad, this is it. Brettonia's these guys are usually rely on their magic resistance or the physical resistance to survive. They perform rather well against squishy units. They of course do have those bound spells, but against Brettonian Cav they'll do pretty horribly. Grail Knights are going to take an absolute dump on these guys. They will destroy Slaanesh Artificers. They'll destroy Doomfire Warlocks in a single charge. You're basically done. With their bonus versus large, with their magic damage, with their high charge bonus, they will just annihilate these units, and it really showed in this game. Granted, these guys did rack up 25 kills, but then again, they didn't soak an entire charge from the Grail Knights. I was actually ignoring them for a good chunk of the fight, so it really, they're just not able to do the job, and they're very expensive. So against Brettonia, I would say they're not very good. Brettonia doesn't have much of a backline for these guys to harass. Now, sure, they'll do well against the Brettonian infantry, but that's not the main threat. The main threat is always going to be those Grail Knights, those Grail Guardians, units like that. And against those, Doomfire Warlocks just suck. They're not a good unit at all. You're basically just bringing them for the bound spells, and I don't think they're really worth it in that situation. If that's the only purpose you have for them. Otherwise, I also do think my opponent did have a lack of anti-large in here. Dark Shards, they're okay. The problem is that Brettonian Heavy Cav, especially in Lance Formation, it will just charge through your lines and then get in on your backline. They'll shrug off your damage from your melee units enough to where they can just run roughshod over your Dark Shards, crush them, and then later on they'll sort of cycle charge and crush your infantry. So I think Blackguard are a good pick. Personally, I prefer Bolt Throwers and Blackguard rather than bringing any Dark Shards at all in this matchup. I'm not a big fan of them because they do get shut down pretty hard by cavalry, and they definitely take a lot of babysitting to make work. I'm definitely a bigger fan of that sort of stuff. The Blackguard, I think, are a good one in this matchup. I'm not entirely sure how Cold War Knights perform in a cost efficiency sort of setting. Brettonia will probably go heavy on cavalry in most matchups, and in that situation, honestly, Brettonia doesn't have the greatest tools to sort of, I don't know how well Cold War Knights would deal. If you brought, say, 6 Cold War Knights against Brettonia, you still have enough money for a reasonably competitive front line, and a decent lord. You can bring Malekith with a handful of spells, and that might be good. I honestly don't know. They might trade well. It's something I haven't really tested before. It's something I haven't really tried, but it might be a strategy. I wouldn't quote myself on it, but it might be. Maybe I'll try it if I get a matchup with Dark Elves against Brettonia. Regardless, good game to my opponent. I do know this was a little lengthy analysis, but definitely had a lot of fun with this matchup. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it entertaining, and hope it perhaps gave you guys some ideas or something like that. If you did enjoy it, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below if you have not already. If you have any comments, any criticism, any questions about the game, be sure to share them down in the comment section, and I will do my best to respond as soon as I can. As usual, guys, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye for now.